America. So thank you. Before we get into it, just a little bit about BST very quickly, shows you why we're here, why we're talking about this today. So BST Impact is an advisory firm that supports sustainable business development and the advancement, promoting a distinct rights-based approach in international standards. And it's also in line with the spirit of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So what today is all about, our purpose, is to raise awareness really about the scale, urgency, and complexity of climate change and a wider carbon challenge associated with social sustainability, good governance, and their impacts on stakeholders and society in general. We hope to improve consciousness through knowledge and attention to key issues. We also hope to empower you to discuss this agenda with your organization or with your clients. What it isn't about, it's not intended to provide a comprehensive or in-depth exploration of the topics covered or provide the skills or competencies which will allow you to either perform tasks or a particular function. BST Impact, we do have wider training services available through our associate knowledge leaders. So if anything does come up during this session and you would like more information on there, or you would like to discuss in detail how we might be able to help, there'll be email addresses, websites, and everything at the end. So a little bit about the speakers today. You've seen us tumbling about on LinkedIn. So here we go. We have Silvia Scosia. Silvia is one of our founding partners and head of law and policy. Sylvia is an expert in humanitarian and human rights law, so don't mess with her. Practical implementation of international standards and legislations into policies and programs. Julia Baselli, also a founding partner, is our risk monitoring and evaluation expert, certified auditor for QSM, so remote and on-the-ground assessments and M&E, our D&I and gender equity technical expert. And myself, John Cannell, I am head of private clients, social value and impact philanthropy. So my knowledge areas are specifically around strategy, impact measurement, social return on investment, ethics, and venture philanthropy. A little bit of a update on what today this session is going to cover. So we're going to look at the background and the environmental impacts on society. We'll have a look at some of the carbon and net zero common definitions, confusing for all. The environmental role and supply chain, looking at scope 1, 2, and 3. We'll also discuss the interconnectedness of the ESG elements, and then things like how we might make the S a bit more concrete, so taking that rights-based approach. We'll cover corporate and social sustainability, why it matters, definitions such as ESG and the relevance with sustainability, CSR, and social value. We'll also have a look at the international legal frameworks, voluntary instruments of guidelines, relevant trends. We'll have a look at some KPIs to round that off as well. So let's have a look. So just to set the scene, give you a bit of a picture on why this is important. There is a very real impact on society. We don't often talk about it from an environmental perspective, but what we do from an environmental standpoint and our impact naturally impacts us as individuals. So we look at, since pre-industrial era, we've seen on average a 1.1% rise in temperatures, the main driver behind carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. Since the 1850s alone, almost all of those can be attributed to human activity. When we look at the difference between 1.5% and 2%, it's quite large. So remember, we're aiming to keep temperatures at 1.5% or now between 1.5 and 2. At the moment, because of the way that we're operating and the policies, the guidelines, and the way that we're tackling it, we're on track for a rise of 2 to 3% by the year 2100. And by that year, we're expected to reach 11 billion people. Now, if we have a look at the from the 1.5 to the 2%, what does that mean? What will we actually see? What's some of the tangible things that we will experience? we'll see a 34% increase in the population experiencing extreme heat. At the moment, that's only 14%. Now, if you consider that that would end up being 4 billion people, that's the size of China. Sea levels are expected to rise by 0.46 of a meter compared to now 0.4 of a meter today. By 2100, we're expecting 10% to live below the waterline. And that's now set to displace 90 million people. That's a huge amount. 13% of our land mass will experience changes to a new biome. And for people that might not be familiar with what a biome is, it is where you have a particular plant species, wildlife that is reliant on a specific climate, geography, that will all be affected. We'll witness the decline of 3 million tons in marine fisheries. A third of us depend on marine or fisheries as our sustenance. The changes that will come in, that will make radical effects or have radical effects on our flora and fauna. It'll change the way in which we have snowfall. It will change rain patterns. It will bring about water shortages. Water security will become more of a challenge, and drought will become more prominent. Again, what does that mean for us as individuals and as a society? Well, at the moment, we already see over 60 million people displaced at any one time at the moment. That's a population the size of Britain. If you consider then what will be the case by the year 2100, adding another, nearly the size of India, whatever that might be in 2100. These are huge, far-reaching implications. We have more drought. Drought creates famine. Famine creates migration. It also creates conflict between the haves and the have-nots. So you can very quickly see what happens from an environmental perspective isn't just about the poles and the polar bears losing their habitat. It's also impacting us as individuals, and it becomes very real, very now. When we have a look at carbon itself, carbon and net zero, there's quite a confusing element here. You know, we have definitions from carbon dioxide equivalents. We have embodied, operational, and whole life carbon. We have carbon footprint, scope 1, 2, and 3. We also have carbon neutral versus net zero. They can be quite challenging. And then you add into that the HFCs, the CO2s, methane, sulfur hexafluoride, nitrous oxide. You know, it builds and builds and builds. We've got 6 listed there. They don't all impact greenhouse gases in the same way, and they don't they don't exacerbate or accelerate at the same pace. So to get a common grounding, we use carbon dioxide as our baseline. So let's have a look at some of those things I just spoke about. If we look at embodied carbon, that's the emissions associated with materials and construction process through the whole life cycle of an asset. And it also means emissions from maintaining through to demolition. If you have a look at operational carbon, that's emissions produced during the use of an asset. Or we have whole life carbon, which is an amalgamation of both of those embodied and operational carbons. And then we have others such as carbon neutral, where we'll be looking, you know, it's a little bit less onerous, and that requires purchasing carbon credits for used carbon over a period of time, to net zero, which really means reducing our emissions in line with the latest climate scientists. And that's balancing the remaining or residual with carbon credits, so carbon neutral. Carbon neutral is usually the first place that businesses and we all start out on, because it's easier to understand and grasp. If we have a look, I talked about the scope 1, 2, and 3 there, and when you move through the different types of carbons, it actually has an impact beyond what you do as well and beyond your business. The impact also is on your supply chain. So this is why there is a need to have an efficient and comprehensive monitoring and tracking of greenhouse gas emissions. So when we look at these a little bit further in detail, we have scope 1, they're direct emissions by an organization through to the use of boilers, vehicles, etc. And then we move into scope 2, and they represent indirect emissions that might be through the purchase of power and heating, electricity to run your businesses. And then there's the scope 3, which is the more indirect, and they're a lot harder to quantify and qualify, and they're usually through things like buying products and services, or business travel. Even the commute from your employees are going to be affected by that scope. So they're very detailed, and there is a number of countries around the world and growing that they are making legislative change to make these mandatory reporting. So we need to get and understand what all of this is, as in the basics, so that we can then see what we're doing, we can monitor and then report so that we're compliant. I just want to give you not a bit of it's not alarming information, but just to add a bit of context in there. We reached a record high greenhouse gas emissions in May of 2020. We emitted 0.417 parts per million. Doesn't matter what the figures are, emissions need to fall by 8% year on year to stem the rise and hold our temperatures at 1.5 to 2%. Now, during the COVID years, we were only able to achieve 5%. So given what economies are doing to try and improve and boost and get back to where we were pre-2020, it's quite frightening that we've still got such a long way to go. Now, some of the areas that we find or we struggle with is we focus on the environment, which is all, well and fine. But we tend to miss out the next two, or we don't do the next two. And what we don't realize, and how where we're missing the boat here, is that there isn't interconnected between the environmental, the social, and the governance. There is no means of doing any one in isolation. We spoke earlier, I did, on what happens in the environment, how it will impact us socially. And we need those governance structures around to mitigate that risk and to help us meet our targets. So there's a need for companies to understand and address externalities, something which will become essential in maintaining your social license over time. But yet there's still this gap between what companies talk about and what companies' actions are. And that's due to this part, understanding that interconnection, the interdependence and connectivity between each of those. Once we realize that, and once we see that we can't tackle anyone in isolation, we'll start to see where you've drawn a line in the sand, you can see what you do, and then we'll start to move forward. So what we'll do, we've spoken a bit there on the interconnectedness, we've spoken about supply chain, we've also spoken about how it's hard, it's difficult to say contextualize that S within ESG. So bring in Julia here now, this is where, Julia, how do we talk about, or how do we define that S and make it a bit more concrete?
Well, thank you, John, for your intervention, and I hope you can all hear me. And first of all, I want to thank all of you for being here, for managing to be in here. We know we had some technical issue with the website page, but I see that many of you are gathering here, so I'm very happy about that. And also, I wanted to take the opportunity to mention, in case we didn't before, that if you have any questions, just write it in the comments, and we will either address it at the end of the webinar, towards the end, or if there is not enough time, then we can get in contact and discuss it further. So thank you, John, again, for passing the floor to me. And thank you also for mentioning a couple of concepts that are very useful for us to introduce this new topic, that is how to make the social aspect of the ESG paradigm more concrete as possible by using a rights-based approach. And one of the issues here is that, as you said, there is a much more fragmented international legal framework when it comes to social aspects compared to the environmental aspects. And also that social aspect mean different things in different contexts. So this is what can cause some confusion sometimes to companies and organizations when it comes to what exactly and how do we quantify, measure our social impact. So here comes in our help what we use as a rights-based approach, which means that we will have a conscious and systematic integration of the international norms, standards, and principles in all aspects of our businesses, which mean integrating international standards, starting from the way we develop our policies, our strategies in our everyday operation, and we embed them overall in our corporate culture. Now, this kind of approach will allow you to consider not to go a little bit beyond what is considering your financial return from one particular operation or process that you're undertaking within your business, but also to see how such activity can, if doing right, impact positively the standards of living and the enjoyment of rights of the communities that are mostly in contact with you and your site of operation. And you can see in the long run, if you're helping induce more prosperities in the community, making them healthier communities, which in the end will also foster more prosperous markets, which are eventually the ideal place also for business to thrive. So this means to apply a rights-based approach to business operation. But despite the fact that, as we are saying, we are applying international norms and standards, right? Nevertheless, we need to remember to contextualize our standards and our principles, because the external factors, the context where we operate, will obviously influence the way we operate our activities and our internal working environment. So it is very important to recognize the specific risks and opportunities and the kind of stakeholders that come from operating in a specific environment, in a specific context. And only then we can elaborate strategies and policies that make sense in that context. And I want to give you a very specific example for what that means to apply a rights-based approach to a very specific activity of a business. That is, just as an example, giving a training or promoting educational activities within your business, let's say around the issue of sexual harassment. Now, you will not only probably comply with local legislations and regulations, because in many countries, companies are obliged to give certain trainings to workers, so you're compliant with laws and regulations. You're raising awareness among your workers around this issue, and you're also allowing them to understand exactly which kind of behavior is tolerable and which is not acceptable. So this will make your workplace a better and safer workplace. But by applying a rights-based approach, you are going beyond that, because your workers will go out of the working place, will go back to their families, to talk to their friends, to their communities, and they will act hopefully differently, because they are now more empowered and knowledgeable about this topic. So you will hopefully take a sort of wave of change in the way a whole community can perceive a certain topic, and help, for instance, combating cultural stigmatization when it comes to sexual harassment or violence, which in some communities, it's unfortunately a very prominent issue. So that's why we chose this example. So that it means to apply a wider lens to one specific activity, going beyond compliance and making your workplace better, but also trying to influence the way people interact around that topic by promoting awareness and empowering people to knowledge. Now, proceeding to next slide, John, I just want to highlight a few elements that I think are very important for us to understand why it really matters to develop social sustainability strategies. Although, as you will see later with my colleague, Silvia Scozia, many of the instruments we use are voluntary instruments. So you're not legally obliged to apply it, but the regulatory framework is changing around this issue. So you will see that later with Silvia. But in general, let's keep in mind that social sustainability helps you, as of now, access new financial instruments, because market has changed and there are thematic bonds, taxonomy, and loans that revolve around sustainability of a company or business or organization. And then it will help you improve performance, because there are countless studies that demonstrate that more sustainable businesses have better financial performances. So you not only create more value for yourself, but for your shareholders, to attract more investors, and also improving your competitive advantage when it comes to market benchmarking. Then it will help you with your brand value and reputation, of course. As I said, the market is changing, and stakeholders' demands, including consumers and workers, are changing, and they demand to see more transparency when it comes to sustainable business practice. And contrarily, nobody, especially investors, wants to be associated with what is called unethical or deemed unethical business, or that is below the market benchmark, because of course they will feel reputational damage as well and bring their money elsewhere, right? And then it will also help you obtain a social license to operate. Now, what is the social license to operate? Is the approval or acceptance by local community, or in general also broader set of stakeholders, by gaining their trust and legitimizing your operation in that specific context with that community. And you do that by meeting and exceeding stakeholders' demands and expectations. It is important to note that while this is essential for you to operate smoothly in a certain context, this really doesn't happen overnight. It's quite a long process, so you need to be patient with that, but nevertheless, it's very important. And then finally, as John mentioned already, it is incredibly important to understand that E, S, and G elements are interconnected, so they hinder or help each other. So if you, say, are active in environmental projects, but you neglect or ignore what are the impacts or the influence it is subject to from the social aspect perspective or from the governance perspective, you are really missing half of the picture. And it will be harder for you to communicate what your real efforts are, also to understand it yourself, actually. What is your real impact around the project that you are putting your effort in? So by saying this, I probably want to, leave the floor to you, John, because I think there are some concepts, let's say, some terms that we often use related to social sustainability that are not really interchangeable, although people sometimes confuse them. So I leave the floor to you just to clarify a little bit the difference between these terms that we often see associated with social sustainability. Thank you, John.
Thanks, Julia. And yes, spot on 100%. We see lots of definitions and acronyms floating around in addition to the ESG. From sustainability and businesses that are involved in procurement, we need to ensure that business takes account of the positive and negative impacts that it has in society as a result of delivering that contract and the additional social value that it brings by being within that community. And then you look at philanthropy, and philanthropy is different ways that you can be supporting, or different ways that business might support the communities, whether that be through some kind of social investment. Maybe that might be looking at catalytic capital. It might be looking at resilient capital that sits there as a partner in helping different parts of society maybe become a bit more resilient and sustainable in how it operates. So we've spoken about the different types, the complexities between how structures operate and how we need to be bit more mindful of all of the different elements of the environment and the social. So how is it that we, as a global society, how do we look at those international frameworks and bring them together? So let's go over to Sylvia now. Sylvia, would you be able to just give us an overview of all of those different structures and the reason why they're important?
Absolutely. Thank you, John. So I think that before answering your question and introducing the international legal framework, it is important for those who are not familiar with the concept to just explain what do we mean when we talk about human rights? What are human rights exactly? And we can refer to human rights as all freedoms and entitlements that exist simply because we are human beings. So they are universal, they are inalienable, which means that they cannot be taken away. They are indivisible, equal, they're inherent to us all. And they range from civil and political rights to economic, social, and cultural rights. And this branch, as you were saying, are very interlinked. So, for example, individuals who cannot access education might have challenges in participating in the political life of their community. As well, if you think about workers who cannot freely express their opinion, they will have more difficulties in collectively bargain for the reivindication of their rights, and so on. So starting from this point, you will see that the international legal framework can be sometimes a bit overwhelming because there are various sources, they are different, they can be binding or non-binding, so that there can be hard law or soft law, so voluntary instruments. But what is important to keep in mind here is that they are all based on this consensus that has been reached in the international community over the years on the codification of human rights. This agreement is enshrined in various legal instruments that have already been accepted by states and civil society as the standard of reference for the meaningful enjoyment of human rights. So you can look at, for example, the International Labour Organization Forced Labour Convention as an example of a treaty, so a binding instrument, or you can look at a soft law instrument, for example, the Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, a voluntary guidance document. Soft law means that these instruments are not legally binding, but still they constitute a powerful and an authoritative guidance for the implementation of human rights obligations. Now, keep in mind that the international law has been traditionally directed primarily at states. So states are the duty bearers of international law. However, today, its instruments have evolved to address directly private business conduct and set a standard of expected behavior for companies, which is then incorporated into the specific national legislation that we are seeing developing, national and regional, as we will see in the next few slides. So as you said before, Giulia, the consequences of non-compliance with international standards can be very serious, and they can go from reputational to financial risks, but also to criminal liability. So we need to consider this risk that if harm has occurred, there is the risk of being associated with human rights abuses. This can be done in two different levels. There is the legal threshold. So if we think about from the legal perspective, we think about a threshold that is usually the standard of aiding and abetting in the commission of a violation of human rights. That, in a nutshell, is when a company is knowingly providing practical assistance or encouragement that has a substantial effect on the commission of a crime. On the other hand, the other level is perceived complicity, and this risk is, of course, much higher because the possibility of being associated with a human rights abuse is broader. And this can happen when companies are seen, for example, to benefit from a human rights abuse that is committed by another party. So this risk can be strongly mitigated by a robust due diligence, human rights due diligence process. Because this process allows companies to show that they have taken every reasonable step to avoid the involvement with human rights abuses. And we have instruments that provide a harmonized guidance around these complexities. For example, we see the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights that are quite well known and that apply to all companies, so regardless of their size, of their location, of their sector. And they require businesses to prevent, identify, mitigate, or remediate, if harm is occurred, adverse human rights impacts that are generated through their own activities or as a result of business relationship with other parties. Now, an interesting point that is important to highlight, and that can be interesting to note about the guidance provided by the guiding principles, is exactly the guidance that they provide to companies that have to navigate conflicting requirements. So when they find themselves in situations where international standards are in contrast with national legislation. And the principles say that the companies are encouraged to uphold international standards to the greatest extent possible in the circumstances. But this can be interpreted in the sense that international law does not require companies to go against national legislation. So no company is expected to violate domestic law. But they are expected to demonstrate their efforts to respect international standards. And this is where a rights-based approach helps, because it facilitates this effort, allowing for a credible and a transparent communication, and even around challenges or shortcomings or exactly obstacles that are hindering progress. Another instrument that is important to mention is the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, which cover all areas of business responsibility and have been, by the way, recently updated. Then, as you may already know, the Sustainable Development Goals that are at the heart of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. They are the successor of the 8 Millennium Development Goals, but they cover the 3 dimensions of sustainable development. So economic growth, social inclusion, and environmental protection. As we've seen, quite strictly connected. This instrument is directed to both government and private companies. So both government are expected to establish national frameworks for the implementation of programs directed at the achievement of the global goals and monitor also their progress. And at the same time, all private companies and organizations are expected to act responsibly and contribute to this progress, exactly, to a positive impact in the different areas of the goals. We know that this may sound overwhelming. We know that there is already a lot of information. But the message that we would really like to leave with you on this specific topic is that there is a common ground to all these instruments, and that international law and the international framework provides this guidance because international human rights law is the basis of all these instruments. And these instruments that have been agreed by states are now being somehow transposed into regulations applicable also to private enterprises. So they all expand to the private sector the expectations that are already set forth in human rights law and that are, as we will see, the basis of the current legislative developments, especially in the European Union. So we'll see in the next slide recent interesting developments in this sense. So in the European Union, especially, the regulatory effort goes in the direction of fighting greenwashing and social washing and harmonizing reporting. And if we look at these developments, we'll see that repercussions will happen not only for EU-based companies, but also for businesses outside the EU region. And this may be for various reasons. It may be because companies are part of the value chain of the EU-based companies. It may be because they are themselves EU operating companies, or simply because they have to account account for stakeholders' values. So This may include shareholders that are concerned about the effects that EU standards may have on their investment. An example is the EU taxonomy. That is a regulation aimed at classifying sustainable economic activities to scale up authentic sustainable investments, and it does so by providing definitions according to which economic activities can be considered sustainable through screening criteria. So for the taxonomy, environment is the primary focus, but the social dimension is present, not only through safeguards, but also through a specific social taxonomy that has been developed that looks at screening activities with the social lens, so to see whether economic activities are substantially contributing to achieving social objectives, always using international standards as a basis. In this case, specifically, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. A very recent development is also regards the process of the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, or CSDDD. The development is that the European Parliament has recently adopted the directive as a negotiating text. Now, this directive requires companies to identify, prevent, and mitigate human rights and environmental violations throughout their value chain. So the scope of application proposed is quite broad. It makes it compulsory for EU operating companies to produce and implement a due diligence strategy across their upstream and downstream chain, so vis-a-vis suppliers and customers, regardless of where the adverse impact on human rights may take place. And this means that companies falling within the scope of the directive are required to scrutinize not only their own activities, but also those of their suppliers and downstream business partners, including those based outside of the EU, to ensure that these do not have abusive practice in place that violate human rights. So the scope is wide. The repercussions are huge, or can be huge, because they go also to a ban on operating in the EU internal market whatsoever. But it is important to keep in mind that due diligence, so not to be scared and to try and sort of imagine a calibration of these efforts, it is important to keep in mind that due diligence is always a risk-based effort, is always proportionate, and is always context-specific. So the extent of the implementing actions that you are required to put in practice depends on the risks of the adverse impact that you can that you are causing, that you are contributing to, or that you can reasonably foresee. Now, this development is interesting because the text that is now being adopted by European Parliament will go into a negotiation process, so a trialogue that will negotiate the differences between this proposed text, the one of the Commission, and the one of the Council. And there are a few areas that will be under negotiation still. So in 2024, we would see the developments, and after this process is concluded, the text should be transposed into domestic law by EU member states. So we'll be observing these developments. Now, there are other important trends in the area of reporting, and perhaps, John, you can explain what we should expect from these developments.
Yeah. Thanks, Julia and Sylvia. Thank you. So just that's really interesting what you're talking about there with each of the EU directives. I think from the Corporate Sustainable Reporting Directive, the CSRD, I think it's really interesting, particularly because it affects supply chain. But it's actually being developed, I think they also call it the Green Deal. It's being developed to make Europe the first climate neutral continent by 2050, not net zero. So it just goes back to what we were talking about earlier on before, the difference between net zero and climate neutral. So all the carbon credits. But when you're talking about CSRD and the impact on supply chain, this has an impact on other jurisdictions such as the UK, where the UK will have very specific reporting and very specific criteria. And I think it comes back to your point earlier on, Julia, when you were talking about not to go against domestic law and regulation, but how you embed that in, and I think you were also talking about, Sylvia, as well, how you embed those global policies and directives on top of local legislation. So when we look in the UK, we've got the Streamlined Energy and Carbon Reporting that's been around for a little bit, and it's really for I suppose larger organizations where there might be, say, 36 million in income or assets of 18 million and over 250 employees. When you then move on to the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, again, it bumps it up a bit more. Mandatory requirements on organizations of over 500 million income or 500 employees. And then we have the upcoming, they're the Sustainable Disclosure Standards. They're a take on the EU taxonomy, the CSDDD and the CSRD, and how they're adapted to be implemented in the UK. But so we have a common governance or a common framework, especially for multinational companies that are operating in each of these jurisdictions. And then from a reporting standards, there's the British Standards Reporting, which is a BSI, the precursor to many of the frameworks, I suppose, that we have. So as we're talking about that, let's have a look at some of the governance and the KPIs around. It's great having all of this legislation and policies, and you need organizations like BST to help interpret all of that so that it can be adapted to companies. But what's some of that? Let's have a look at some of the KPIs. And Julia, if you can jump in here and just have a talk through about the integrated systems and smart KPIs.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, John. So we are going to lead now towards the last letter of the ESG paradigma, that is the governance. So, but not intended in the sense that now I will tell you how to elect, remunerate, and compose your board of directors. Of course, we will not go into so much details. We just want to highlight the fact that because of the elements of the ESG are so interconnected, it is very important to understand a few issues about governance, and especially the so important role it has into being the structure and the fundament of everything else you built on, because this is the solid ground for your organization and business to be built on that will help you achieve or not many of your other targets. So if the structure itself of your organization is not solid and is not projected towards sustainable business models, it will be quite unlikely that you will achieve your target regarding environmental or socially related activities quite successfully. So that's why we want to underline how important it is that you see governance as an integrated system together with the other elements. Now, I'm expecting that most of you here know what governance is, what we mean by governance, that is the leadership, the decision-making, the culture of our organization, and the control and accountability mechanism that we set up in our organization that go from the boardroom towards all the chain, to our managers, supervisors, and workers and stakeholders. Now, it is very important, though, that when we think about governance as projected towards sustainable business models, is to understand the importance of the governing bodies. And normally it would be the highest governing bodies, that is the board of directors in certain circumstances, but according to the structure of your organization, you might not have one. So in general, we will call it highest governing body. That is their role and responsibility that is huge in a sense. So they are the ones to promote the stakeholder engagement. They are the one responsible for approving the strategies and objectives that are linked to ESG activities. They are the one responsible to ensure that when risks are identified, they are prevented, seized, mitigated, and remedied if needed. And they are the one responsible to ensure that anything you do within your business follow formalized procedures and is adequately monitored. So as you can see, their level of responsibility is quite high, and sustainability matters do not fall only to the ESG team or person that you have in charge, but it is actually go quite high up to the top of the management in terms of accountability and responsibility. And that's for those of you who might be a bit more acquainted with the auditing system, you might recognize a familiar term that is a PDCA approach. That is a way to structure your processes and procedures in your business activities and organization in general. It means, it stands for plan, do, check, and act. So everything needs to follow a certain cycle that is called also Deming cycle, that is planning your activity, determining your goals and targets, who's gonna do what is the budget, and who's responsible for what. Once I've planned anything, I will implement what I have been planning, and then check-in phase means I monitor what I have done so far. Is it going good? Am I doing this right? Or is there something that needs to be changed that is not performing correctly? So in that case, I will register all this information. And then in the act phase, I will either standardize what has been working, or I will either change what didn't work, because continuous improvement is an essential part of good governance that we need to structure within this cycle of how we standardize our procedures in our business operation. And now when we talk about identified, if we have been able to achieve certain targets, how we did it, and to measure and quantify our activities in a sense. Many of you will know that we would recur to using KPIs, right? Like a list of KPIs that is a measure, quantifiable measure of our performance that we registered over time for a specific target. Now, also in this case, when we talk about indicators, as was I mentioning for the rights-based approach, it is extremely important as a starting point to understand the context and who are the stakeholders that are most impacted by our business or that can impact mostly our business in order to create a materiality matrix. Once I have identified my material topic, that is the topic that are most impactful or that have the most influence on my operation, I can then define my targets and my indicators to reach certain targets. You can give any sort of elaboration you want to your indicators, but most people would choose the SMART indicators that stand for specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. So again, this is just one elaboration. You can choose whichever you want, but I would say that in general, be sure to at least follow some very basic characteristics for an indicator. That is, it must be meaningful, and this will come from your materiality matrix. So to decide what actually makes sense to register and to measure in a certain context. It must be measurable, so it must quantify your effort and your activity, and it must be specific, that is to say, linked to a particular goal. So it is better to avoid indicators that are too generic. I would say these are the characteristics that we should keep in mind when we set our indicators based on a materiality matrix. And again, setting indicators is something that pertains to governance, because there has to be somebody who is responsible for doing it, for calculating and measuring impact, and establishing which are the competences that we need our personnel to have to do this. And then I think, John, you can, when you talk about measurement and indicators, then it all flows towards communicating about all this information that we have gathered through the indicators, and most likely to report about it on ESG matters. So maybe you can give us this overview of the frameworks that we use for reporting initiatives.
Certainly, yeah, sure. I mean, there's a lot. There's many different frameworks for ESG reporting, and developed by different groups for different reasons, and adapted by different companies across industries. There's also a number of ESG data providers. They offer ESG ratings and scores as well. So, but some frameworks, they're primarily focused on environmental impact and carbon. Or carbon emissions. There's others that address human rights concerns, and then others that are comprehensive. They encompass several different ESG aspects. what's important, as Julia spoke of, is understanding your materiality, which helps inform sort of your choice and direction and which way you're going to go. You know, just having a look at some of them, you know, if we look at CPD, you know, CPD is the Carbon Disclosure Project, but that also now includes water and deforestation. Or you have the Climate Disclosure Standards Boards. You know, that also then is a take on from CDP. So, you know, a bit of an all-encompassing. And then we've got some that might be the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures is more related to, as you would imagine, investors, and SASB, which is in there as well, which again, it's more investor focused. So you can see some differences in how they all operate. And then you've got the IFRS, which is in support of the International Standards, Sustainability Standards Board, again, used by lots of governments and regulators when they're setting things up. So quite a diverse, and a lot depends on where you are on the spectrum, where you are in your journey, where you are in understanding your materiality. You can't really you can't really operate on these alone, because whenever you're coming back to it, Julia and Sylvia spoke about it earlier on, is your social license, and how does that always relate to? That's ethics. So let's just come back to Julia there, have a bit of a talk to us on around ethical claims and why it's important.
Yeah, thank you, John. Yeah, just to wrap it up before we start to closing our event and going to the Q&A session, because we spoke about reporting framework and ESG report in general, I just wanted to underline the importance of a couple of concepts here when we talk about the statement that we make or our ethical claims. Now, an ESG report is classified as an ethical claim just as much as an ESG rating or a logo or a mark that you put on your products. So all of these are ethical claims. But to be real and valid ethical claims, they should follow a couple of, let's say, requirements. First of all, they should be accompanied by reliable and unbiased data that you promote or that you made available to your stakeholders, so they are able to verify and validate your statement or sustainability claims. Otherwise, it will be very difficult to differentiate what is just a statement or a wishful forward-looking thinking, rather than a true, realistic, and reliable claim. So that means that if you are providing statements regarding a past performance, you are also providing the information and the data that will allow us, a stakeholder, to verify that your claim is true. Or whereas you are promoting, for instance, projected performance that you will perform in the future, you also need to provide data that normally would come from risk probability analysis that will allow us, again, stakeholders in general, to evaluate the plausibility of what you're stating. Like, it is realistic. So is it plausible that you will actually reach this goal? So these are the data that you should keep in mind to accompany your statement when you make any ethical claims. And to enhance the credibility of your ethical claims, you can also resort to audit and due diligence that will help reinforce your claims if you undergo these kind of procedures, for instance, and also to lower the risks that are related to ESG aspects in general. And remember, although when you resort to audit, they should be, let's say, unbiased, free from conflict of interest, and competent people. So normally, I would say, because of market change, normally self-assessments now are seen as less credible than before. So make sure, I'm not like exhorting you to resort to third-party audits necessarily, because also internal audits or any sort of due diligence that you can provide is valid, but just make sure that the competences are there and that integrity is there and professionalism is there. So with this, I will wrap up my part, and I will leave it to you, Sylvia, to conclude a little bit this webinar that was just an overview, a panoramic of using a rights-based approach for ESG matters. Thank you, Sylvia.
Thank you, Julia, and thank you, John, for this insightful overview. I just would like to close with a couple of points on what we do, just to give an information on how we work. So our approach has been the object of this webinar as a common, let's say, fil rouge to present issues of environmental, social, and governance, so aspects of sustainability that can be addressed with the rights-based approach in mind. Now, we value the expertise that is needed to meaningfully address these complex issues. And because of this, we offer our clients diverse expertise, and we work as a network. So depending on the needs of our clients and the nature of the project, we offer bespoke services in collaboration with partners, specialized partners, and associate experts that are have specific competencies and complementary competencies across the spectrum of sustainability. You can see some of our services on the slide. There are more on our website. You have the address on the slide. So I don't know how much we have, how long we have to address some questions. I don't know if there are any questions you'd like to address. We would like to hear from you also about topics that you would like to learn about in our future training activities. So if you can put 1, 2, 3, or 4 in the comments, that will help us to also have your feedback and orientate a little bit our future activities. If you follow us on LinkedIn, you can receive updates and keep abreast of our future initiatives. And I can ask Julia or John if there are any questions we would like to address, or if we can just say a few words about a question that we are very often asked and that perhaps can be of interest generally to the audience. And the question that we are very often asked is, where do I start? So we know that that really it can be overwhelming to try and understand the way forward, and which is why we also wanted to tell you to feel free to get in touch just to understand where you're currently at. And we would be happy to offer guidance and orientation on where you can start to improve your sustainability. And this starts from, let's say, a snapshot of your current performance, a gap analysis of to know where are the highest risks that need to be addressed urgently, where are the areas that perhaps you are already generating positive impact, but you are not fully harnessing this potential because, for example, either you're not measuring the right things or you're not communicating with the relevant data, you're not substantiating your claims with relevant data. So this is something that we offer and that we often encounter with our clients. Now, Julia, is there anything else?
So we have a couple of questions that are probably pertaining to John. So John, if you can see them on the chat, you can take a look at it and think about it while I will add something very quickly to what Sylvia just said. So it is true that many times we are asked, okay, but where do I start? I mean, I don't know, I don't have the expertise to do all of this that you're telling me to do. And well, of course, we would argue that sometimes it is good to just rely on external help because there are professionals doing this. And I guess most of you here today are also professional in the field. So you know the value of the expertise in these sectors. That is quite complicated and quite complex sometimes to master certain topics. But in general, for all of those who are wondering, okay, where do I start? I mean, for me in particular, as an auditor, the most important pillar upon which you build everything else is governance. So to structure properly your organization and the way you do your business and your activity through formalized procedures and through proper activities and with proper accountability and responsibility shared in the chain, let's say, of the various professions that you have within your organization is essential. So if you want to look at exactly where do I start, even to tackle social or environmental aspects, well, start from your own governance and make sure that the structure is there for you to project any kind of activity you undertake in a sustainable way and with the right competences and with a proper monitoring and evaluation mechanisms that are quite essential in general to gather a lot of good information that you will need to address risks and issues that might arise by operating in certain contexts. So I'm sorry if I took longer than expected. So John, up to you if you want to answer the question that was directed mostly to you.
Yeah. So I think too, I think just quickly, very touching on what both of you have said, then that is extremely important when people, lots of businesses and people, we just don't start because we're either worried that we'll get it wrong. It's too confusing. There's so much detail out there. But the very point that you're looking at what you currently have going on, what you're currently doing, you're drawing a line in the sand and you can only move forward from there. So, you know, that's the starting point, really. The couple of questions that were in the chat, I thought they were really interesting. So the one particularly where we were able to you know, reach the 5%, that 3% difference during the COVID years, that wasn't through industry effort, specifically at reaching a particular target. It does show that we're capable of doing it. You know, we found lots of ways of trying to keep business and industry going. We became very creative and we were very innovative during those times. We've kind of lost that a little bit now, but it sort of then leads into that other question that was on there around how do you account for those scope 3 emissions, because they are quite hard and they involve things such as, you know, employees commuting, and that comes back to COVID when all of a sudden a big portion of us were working from home. We were doing everything online, so therefore our carbon footprint was quite considerably less. Global process and infrastructure shut down. And even the lag behind that is only just now starting to get up. We had shortages of containers, we had shortages of transport in the year after COVID, and when we came back to some kind of normality. So if you're ever looking at how you might account for that, you always need to determine sort of 3 capabilities. Estimate your greenhouse gas emissions is always, an important area, and they can vary in accuracy, depending on the availability of data, the organization's quantification of its goal, and also to improve how you're expanding your emissions, but you're contracting them instead. So it is quite difficult. There's a reason why it's not mandatory at the moment, because it's exponential as well. Where do you stop? So come back to my other point a moment ago, take that first step, look to see what you are doing now, even in your scope 3. So if you have changed tact, pre-COVID, you were commuting in every single day and your workforce was commuting to somewhere central, whereas now a majority still work from home, carbon miles. When you're looking at, do we need to travel for meetings? Again, carbon miles. What about our suppliers? What are our suppliers doing when we're buying services? It's being more knowledgeable and asking those questions. There's actually there's a number of platforms that are open to helping you measure that, especially with supply chain. Again, not recommending any, but just to highlight one, EcoVadis is one that helps with supply chain and understanding all of those nuances that can support starting to tackle your scope 3. I mean, I'm not a legal expert or government official to know when they're coming in the different parts of the different jurisdictions, but they are coming. And as we spoke about from the very beginning around the impact on society, they have to come. We have to be doing this. We're not going to see, well, I won't see the immediate changes. If I live to 2100, that's brilliant. But we need to always be looking at what next. We need to always be looking at the impact of our actions, both as an individual, but then within companies, which are made up of individuals. This is where we start from. I always recommend and say to people, don't start big picture. Start small, one thing at a time, and you'll build on scale from there. And that's how we'll achieve this. So we have there's one. Let's have a look at one last question and see what's there.
Yeah. I think I can answer to that as well. Yeah, probably taking this one last question. And then, of course, if you have more questions, you can keep, the post is going to be available on the BST LinkedIn page. So you can just go there and write your comment, or just chat to us directly and just get in contact with us directly. And we'll be very happy to chat and answer more of your questions and discuss further any issue you might have or clarification you might need. So this last question is about if the reporting should fall also to the financial aspect, or if environmental and sustainable profession skill sets are key when it comes to reporting. I would say in general, yes, you need some set of skill set. Now, it doesn't have to be that only people like us that are professional on sustainability will have this skill set, that they can be learned. So there are training available that will enable people in an organization to undertake certain activities. In general, when it comes to reporting, there are some more specific and complex measurements to make that might require particular skill sets that normal, like people that are not professional or expert in the field, might find difficult to find or to understand and to quantify. That's why it is important, probably also, even just at the beginning, to have a setup done from somebody who is the expert in the field, or is a professional that does that for a living, I would say, and that help you, guide you through the whole process, at least to set up the procedures that you need to undertake and how you need to measure and what you need to measure. So I would say that I would not discard that other kind of expert can undertake the activities that you need to do reporting, but measurement and calculating and quantifying impact, especially for social issue or some very specific environmental issue, you definitely need the experts or the professionals that know about that specific topic. Sustainability is not general. It is very hard to find a person that would tell you, I'm a ESG expert 360 degrees. We are quite specific in our sector. So we are human rights lawyers, for instance. We deal mostly with social and governance part. I'm not an environmental engineer, so I would not undergo any kind of environmental assessment. I'm not able, and I don't want to pretend to be able to do that. So I think this is what makes these topics particularly complex, and that's why you might need different skill set to undertake specific activities. And in fact, even when you do, for instance, a social impact assessment in a geographical areas where you have to undergo a project, you usually go in team because you need different expertise. So I don't know if John or Cida, you want to add anything on this before wrapping up.
I think a lot of it comes down to materiality. That's a common theme that's gone through today. There isn't one size that fits all. And for the ethical standpoint and the social license, we have access to knowledge quicker, faster, better than we've done at any time in history. So people are more in tuned and quicker to call out poor behavior. So this materiality and matching and understanding with your values and to make that social license concrete, it has to be relevant to your organization. You know, when we spoke about before the different requirements around SASB and CDP, and, you know, there's lots there, but they're all relevant to specific industries by specific organizations at specific times in your journey as well. So there isn't one size that fits all. And so that would where I would leave it at. And I think in order to move further, you need to understand where you are now. Once you do that, it's only forward from there. That's all from me.
Thank you, John. And thank you, everybody, for your attention. We've been going for a little bit longer than expected, but hopefully this has been interesting for you and has helped you understand how to navigate the interconnected dimension of sustainability and understand what a rights-based approach is and why it is important. We are available to receive your questions and please feel free to get in touch for even just to know more about what we do and talk with us more. If you'd like to follow us on LinkedIn again, it is very helpful to keep abreast of updates. And thank you again for your attention. Really, it has been great to chat with you, Julia and John, and we hope that this helped you. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, and have a nice evening, everybody, or a nice day, wherever you are.